Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. We are going to be picking up on part 2 of the Jack Parsons story. If you haven't watched the first part, I will link it in the video description. You should definitely watch that before listening to this because we're picking up in the middle of the story. So just to give a brief introduction to Parsons, he was a rocket scientist, an alchemist, occultist, and godfather of the space program. He was critical in founding the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and advancing the early rocketry that laid the groundwork for NASA's entire space program. And he's been all but erased from his proper place in official history. And of course, as usual, the truth is always much stranger than fiction. Parsons was a visionary, brilliant, but he was also a sperg. He was smart, but like an idiot as well. He was an ardent follower of Aleister Crowley's Thelema, blending magic with science. He was really a magician of the nuclear age. Parsons' influence is still felt today, from space and missile technology to the esoteric New Age and UFO movements. Parsons was the one who popularized Thelema in America, inspiring modern occultists, neo-pagans, wiccans, and chaos magicians. His fusion of science and mysticism and his use of psychedelic substances prefigured the psychedelic and esoteric revival of the 1960s, and a direct line can be drawn to the modern technocrats today who are going on their ayahuasca retreats, taking DMT, and talking to the techno elves. In order to really make sense of the world today, it is important to understand the past, our true history, not the sanitized version that has been presented by official history. This story gets very strange. It is definitely not child-friendly, and it is certainly a cautionary tale. And so we're picking up on part 2, where we're just kind of getting into the Babylon working. Parsons opened a door and something flew in. That is a quote from Kenneth Grant's Outside the Circles of Time. Now, where we left off with Jack, at this point, he's leading the OTO Agape Lodge in Pasadena, California. Having sold off the shares of JPL, his shares, both he and his buddy Ed Foreman leave, and they take like an $11,000 payout at the time, and I believe they sold their shares to Frank Molina, and had they not done that, like what those would be worth today would be millions of dollars, right? So he kind of got a bad deal, but at the time, that was kind of a decent chunk of money. So L. Ron Hubbard is living in the parsonage at this time, and he and Jack would fence. Occasionally, Robert Heinlein would join them. Hubbard and Parsons' girlfriend, really, Betty, had started an affair, and they're kind of putting this in Parsons' face. You know, they're all living in the same house, and Hubbard and Betty would make out at the dinner table in front of Parsons. And so obviously this is causing some trouble, but the entire Agape Lodge at that time is like a big polyamory community. And so it's against their heretical religious beliefs to feel things like jealousy. So he can't really be openly jealous, but that's obviously what's going on. And Hubbard's the kind of person that's like, you know, constantly pushing the boundaries to try to get some kind of response. And then he'll say things to him like, you know, I'm really doing this for your own good. Like, I'm your pal, buddy, and I'm doing this to help you realize your magical whatever, you know. I'm helping you on your magical journey to overcome these lower emotions that you're feeling. It's just total nonsense. And Parsons is doing rituals with his old friend Ed Foreman at this time, outside of the OTO, so separate from the rituals he does with his organization. Now, Jack and Ed are doing their rituals at one night. You know, they do this summoning ritual. And after the ritual's over, Ed comes home that night. He claims that he hears the shriek of a banshee. And he looks out and he sees it. But nobody else can see or hear this alleged being. So after this incident, Ed is pretty much done doing rituals with Parsons. So Parsons needs somebody else that he can do his magical rituals with, and Hubbard is there. There's not really anybody else who's very keen on doing all these rituals with Parsons. So Parsons writes to Crowley in July of 1945. About 3 months ago, I met Captain L. Ron Hubbard, a writer and explorer of whom I had known for some time. He is a gentleman. I mean, the false perceptions here of like, oh my goodness, you know, looking back in hindsight, I can't believe he was this naive, but he says, he is a gentleman. Red hair, green eyes, honest and intelligent, and we have become great friends. He moved in with me about 2 months ago, and although Betty and I are still friendly, she has transferred her sexual affections to him. Although he has no formal training in magic, he has an extraordinary amount of experience and understanding in the field. From some of his experience, I deduce he is in direct touch with some higher intelligence, possibly his guardian angel. He is the most Thelemic person I have ever met, and he is in complete accord with our own principles. He is also interested in establishing the new Aeon, but for cogent reasons, I have not introduced him to the Lodge. We are pooling our resources in a participation which will act as a parent company to control our business ventures. I think I have made great gain, and as Betty and I are the best of friends, there is little loss. I cared for her rather deeply, but I have no desire to control her emotions, and I can, I hope, control my own. I need a magical partner. I have many experiments in mind. So this is what he's saying. These are his early impressions of L. Ron Hubbard. He thinks that he's a gentleman. The magical partner is a reference to Hubbard, by the way, not a Scarlet Woman, as might first be supposed when listening to this. In January of 1946, Parsons devised an operation to, as he worded it, obtain the assistance of an elemental mate. And so, remember that at the same time this is going on, Parsons, Betty, who is the younger half-sister of his ex-wife and was dating him for a time, even when she was underage, has kind of taken an interest in Hubbard and started seeing him. So Parsons, Betty, and Hubbard start a company called Allied Enterprises. That's what he's referencing in this letter. Of course, it was Parsons who puts in most of the money for this, you know, which he got from his sale of stock from JPL to General Tire. The purpose is to buy boats. This was the story that Hubbard basically sold to him, is to buy these yachts on the East Coast, to like go to Florida, buy these boats, and then sail them back to California and sell them at a profit. So Parsons puts in like $21,000, and this is a lot of money at the time. L. Ron Hubbard will put in like $1,000, and of course Betty doesn't have any money, so she has nothing to contribute to this. Now, speaking later on, according to Bent Corridon, L. Ron Hubbard confided in his son, Ron Jr., this is according to Ron Jr., his secrets, techniques, and powers. This is a direct quote, supposedly from L. Ron Hubbard, that he made to his son. Secrets, techniques, and powers I alone have refined, improved on, applied my engineering principles to, science and logic, the keys, my keys to the doorway of the magic, my magic, the power, not Scientology power, my power, the real powers of Solomon. This is the psychotic nonsense that is coming out of L. Ron Hubbard. Crowley was writing to his eventual successor at the OTO, Carl Germer. He writes, "From our brother's account, he has given away both his girl and his money. Apparently, it's the ordinary confidence trick." So even he can recognize that L. Ron Hubbard is a con man. Parsons' friend, Alva Rogers, who was a longtime member of the parsonage who lived there and witnessed these events as they unfolded, described L. Ron Hubbard's role in this way. She says, "Ron was a persuasive and unscrupulous charmer, not only in social groups, but with the ladies." Believe it or not, I know if you look at pictures of him, it's a little questionable, but hey, apparently he was charming. He was so persuasive and charmingly unscrupulous that within a matter of a few weeks, he brought the entire house of Parsons down around poor Jack's ears. He did this by the simple expedient of taking over Jack's girl for extended periods of time. So it's in this backdrop that Parsons sets out to perform the Babylon working ritual. According to Kenneth Grant, the purpose of this ritual is a 9th degree working, and he writes, having lost confidence in women, Parsons decided to attract an elemental spirit to take Betty's place. These spirits are called elementals because of their association with the 4 elements of the ancients. To summon one requires a large amount of magical energy, the kind generated by an 8th degree working, and apparently the practice of this 8th degree working is a solo sexual rite. Grant says, the instructions that accompany the 8th degree of the OTO contain methods for evoking an elemental or a familiar spirit. It is said to be an easy matter to attract such a spirit because the souls of the elements desire constantly to be absorbed into the cycle of human evolution, this being the only way in which they can achieve salvation and perpetuity of existence. On being appropriated by a human organism, the elemental finally becomes absorbed in the immortal principle in man. The core of the working consisted of the utilization of the Enochian tablet of air, or rather a specific angle of it. This was to be the focus of the sexual magic, with the purpose of giving substance to the elemental summons. Parsons continued with this for days, evoking twice daily. He noted various psychic phenomenon during the period, but felt discouraged by the apparent failure of the operation. However, success followed several days later. In his own words, the feeling of tension and unease continued for 4 days. Then, on January 18 at sunset, whilst the scribe and I were on the Mojave Desert, the feeling of tension suddenly stopped. I turned to him and said, "It is done!" in absolute certainty that the operation was accomplished. I returned home and found a young woman answering the requirements waiting for me. She is describable as an air of fire type with bronze red hair, fiery and subtle, determined and obstinate, sincere and perverse, with an extraordinary personality, talent, and intelligence. During the period of January 19 to February 27, I invoked the goddess Babylon with the aid of a magical partner, this is L. Ron Hubbard, as was proper to one of my grade. The young woman who Parsons is talking about is Marjorie Cameron, and it should be noted that like L. Ron Hubbard, like Robert Heinlein, Marjorie Cameron had also worked for the Navy. Make of that what you will. Seems very interesting coincidence there. Now, the purpose of the Babylon working, the elaborate sex magic ritual, was to bring Babylon into a physical manifestation. So they're literally trying to bring about like a false female messiah type figure. From the Book of Babylon, which is something that Parsons penned, he writes, "It is indicated that this force is actually incarnate in some living woman as the result of the described magical operation. A more basic matter, however, is the indication that this force is incarnate in all men and women. It needs only to be invoked to free the spirit from the debris of the old aeon and direct the blind force of Horus into constructive channels of understanding and love." The text then goes on to describe the actual ceremonies that Hubbard and Parsons performed together between January 4th and 15th in 1946, as Crowley and the poet Victor B. Neuburg had done in the Algerian desert of 1909. Parsons and Hubbard used the Enochian system of magic developed by the Elizabethan magician John Dee and Edward Kelly. It was no coincidence that Parsons chose to use the Enochian system, since it was through it that many key spiritual doctrines of Thelema, including those of the goddess Babylon, had been revealed to Crowley. But whereas Crowley and Neuburg explored the aethers, or spiritual levels, Parsons and Hubbard limited their use of the Enochian system to its third key or call, which is an invocation of the element air, the so-called air tablet. On the first day, they prepared and consecrated an air dagger, which served as the special talisman of the operation, together with an Enochian air tablet on virgin parchment and a parchment talisman. The whole concept of this idea of creating a magical child has different interpretations. Some perceive this to be the use of sex magic to manifest by an act of pure will a magical being in the material basis of which are the bodily fluids themselves. Another interpretation of this ritual is that a moon child, a living child who will serve as the host to a super being, like a child that is an avatar or an incarnation of some kind of magical being. Another interpretation is that the child, the magical child, is the transformed magician himself, or that the child is an astral spiritual child and not like a literal one. Hubbard and Parsons were ostensibly aiming at the literal interpretation, to manifest a scarlet woman willing to conceive a child that would embody this creature, Babylon. Crowley wrote to Carl Germer, Apparently, Parsons or Hubbard or somebody is producing a moonchild. I get fairly frantic when I contemplate the idiocy of these louts. So he thinks that this is not a good idea. Even he doesn't approve of this. In February of 1946, Parsons triumphantly writes to Crowley, "I have my elemental. She turned up one night after the conclusion of the operation and has been with me since." This elemental was Marjorie Cameron, who Parsons believed he had kind of somehow manifested her appearance. She adopts the magical name Candida, which is a certain kind of fungus or yeast. And then she decides to call herself Candy for short. Eventually, she and Parsons get married, and she helps him with his magic. On February 28, Parsons makes a solo trip back to the desert and supposedly receives a book called Liber 49 in an unexplained manner. Jacques Vallée says that Parsons also claimed at this time to have met a Venusian there in 46 or 45. And it is not clear if this creature, this Venusian that he claimed to have met, if that is the entity that gives him the Liber 49 book. Parsons, though, takes this to be an affirmation of the need to produce a magical child. When Hubbard returns, he channeled a message from apparently a red-haired, green-eyed angel, ordering them to light first flame at 10 p.m., March 2nd, 1946. The year of Babylon is 4063. That would be the year 2118, and I don't think anybody knows what the significance of this was, if Hubbard just came up with this out of thin air and just lied, who knows. Cameron returned from New York and is living with Parsons. She becomes integral to the Babylon working, so after Parsons' initial contact with the beyond, Hubbard begins acting as seer, although Parsons refers to him as scribe in his notes. And upon this return of Hubbard, Parsons prepares to impregnate his magical partner, his Scarlet Woman, impressed by the vision that Hubbard had apparently of a savage and beautiful woman riding naked on a great cat-like beast. According to Francis King's account, Parsons was acting as high priest during this ritual, has sex with Marjorie Cameron, while Hubbard, who was there acting as the scryer, seer, and clairvoyant, is taking his notes and apparently just watching this. This occurred on the first 3 days of March 1946. On the evening of March 2nd, a fire apparently started in Parsons' chimney. Later, he decided it had occurred when he had smashed an image of Pan as a sacrifice. The idol had been a favorite personal item of his. The papers containing the seventh heir that he burned may have had something to do with the fire as well. Parsons expressed his confidence, but wrote, "Now I can do no more than pray and wait." On March 6, Parsons writes to Crowley about the recent events. He says, "I can hardly tell you or know now much to write. I am under the command of extreme secrecy. I have had the most important, devastating experience of my life between February 2nd and March 4. I believe it was the result of the 9th degree working with the girl," this is Marjorie Cameron, "who answered my elemental summons. I have been in direct touch with one who is most holy and beautiful, mentioned in the Book of the Law. I cannot write the name at present. First instructions were received through Ron Hubbard, the seer. I have followed them to the letter. There was a desire for incarnation. I was the agency chosen to assist the birth which is now accomplished. I do not yet know the vehicle, but it will come to me, bringing a secret sign I know. Forgetfulness was the price. I am to act as instructor, guardian, guide for 9 months. Then it will be loosed on the world. That is all I can say for now. There must be extreme secrecy. I cannot tell you the depth of reality, the poignancy, terror, and beauty I have known. Now I am back in the world, weak with reaction, but the knowledge remains. I have found my will. It is to serve, and serve I shall. All I am or will is pledged. It is not a question of keeping anything from you. It is a question of not dwelling or thinking unduly on the matter until the time is right. Premature discussion or revelation would cause an abortion. A manuscript, he's referencing the Book of Babylon. A manuscript is prepared, which will be released to the proper persons at the right time. I must ask you to trust me. Your work has made this possible. This will crown your work with success. All the tests are right. There is no danger, save in weakness or pride. My faith is strong. I am humble before the splendor and beauty I have known, and the task is before me. I ask your blessing. So he doesn't really want to tell Crowley the details of the actual magical operation of all the steps that he took. He just tells him this has to be secret. You'll find out in time. This is going to be the achievement of your work. And of course, at this time, Crowley is much older. He's basically a heroin addict, and this young upstart is also kind of challenging him by basically saying that, your understanding of magic is incorrect and I can do it better, basically. So Crowley does not give him his blessing, by the way. Crowley wrote a letter to Parsons in March of 1946 warning him about Marjorie Cameron. He says, I am particularly interested in what you have written to me about the elemental, because for some little while past I have been endeavoring to intervene personally on your behalf. I would, however, have you recall Levy's aphorism, the love of the magus for such beings is insensate and may destroy him. He's talking about Eliphas Levy. It seems to me that there is a danger of your sensitiveness upsetting your balance. Any experience that comes your way, you have a tendency to overestimate. The first fine, careless rapture wears off in a month or so, and some other experience comes along and carries you off on its back. Meanwhile, you have neglected and bewildered those who are dependent on you, either from above or from below. I will ask you to bear in mind that you have one fulcrum for all your levers, and that is your original oath to devote yourself to raising mankind. All experiences, all efforts must be referred to this. As long as it remains unshaken, you cannot go far wrong, for by its own stability it will bring you back from any tendency to excess. At the same time, you being as sensitive as you are, it behooves you to be more on your guard than would be the case with the majority of people. So he's telling him that he's a little bit naive in this letter. And he's warning him that he has to be more on guard with the people around him. Now, the aftermath of this working is the subject of much rumor, and it points out the significance of these types of rituals to the OTO. This secret is the true key to magic, said Crowley. That is, by the right use of this secret, man may impose his will on nature herself. So after this working, this magical operation, L. Ron Hubbard takes off with Parsons' former girlfriend, Betty, the younger sister of his ex-wife, Helen, and the money that Parsons had given him for their joint enterprise. And so this is, a problem. Hubbard leaves, he and Betty go off to Miami, and, Parsons is sitting there waiting to hear from them, like, when are they going to be coming back with the boats and the money? And it just seems like it isn't going to happen. Then Hubbard calls from Miami. He makes him feel a little bit better about it. But other people around the lodge they've kind of figured out what's happened. Crowley's kind of figured out what's happened. And so they're kind of, letting him know, look, you got to go get your money back from this guy, or he's never going to come back, like he's not coming back. So evidently Parsons decides to travel to Miami in July of 1946 to try to catch Hubbard and Betty. They bought 3 boats with the money, and they're out on one of the yachts, and apparently they're going to try to leave Miami to escape Parsons and the law, as he's already notified the law of the situation. And so, as the story goes, while they're trying to, leave Miami, Parsons decides to do a ritual and invokes Bartzabel, the god of Mars, to cause a storm at sea, forcing Hubbard and Betty back to shore. This apparently happened because they did have to turn around and go back, and they were apprehended at that time. Hubbard, nevertheless, marries Parsons' former girlfriend Betty the following month, and then he will go on in the future to write Dianetics, the Science of Mental Health, and to organize the Church of Scientology, built upon, apparently, a fake hidden mythos of a 75-million-year-old disaster in which the inhabitants of a 76-planet galactic federation were blown up by a dictator named Xenu. This science fiction space opera from Hubbard's Pulp Fiction days forms a bizarre underpinning to an already bizarre story. According to Alan Greenfield, L. Ron Hubbard may have had other plans with the Babylon working, that perhaps Hubbard wished to bring some other world into manifestation, but lacked the technical knowledge to do this. And so he sees Parsons as this more naive person that maybe can help him achieve this. In this version, the Babylon working, guided by L. Ron Hubbard, had little to do with the so-called goddess Babylon, and more to do with the hideous old ones of the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos. A door opened, something came through is the essence of this thesis, and the appearance of the first, quote, flying saucer case the following year is considered coincidental, perhaps. And this obviously gets into Kenneth Grant's own Typhonian magical system, so make of that what you will. To give some insight, though, into Parsons' mindset in 1946, he wrote the following in a publication called Freedom is a Two-Edged Sword. Quote, "Objectively, we know nothing at all. Any system of intellectual thought, whether it be science, logic, religion, or philosophy, is based on certain fundamental ideas or axioms which are assumed but which cannot be proven. This is the grave of all positivism. We assume, but we do not know, that there is a real and objective world outside our own mind. Ultimately, we do not know what we are or what the world is. Further, if there is a real world apart from ourselves, we cannot know what it really is. All we know is what we perceive it to be. All that we perceive is conveyed by our senses and interpreted by our brain. However fine, exact, or delicate our scientific instruments may be, their data is still filtered through our senses and interpreted by our brain. However useful, spectacular, or necessary our ideas and experiments may be, they still have little to do with absolute truth. Such a thing can only exist for the individual according to his whim or his inner perception of his own truth in being. He goes on to say, the question is, are we able to face the consequences of democracy? It is not sufficient that freedom be assured by purely negative means. Freedom is meaningless where its expression is controlled by powerful groups such as the press, the radio, the motion picture industry, churches, politicians, and capitalists. Freedom must be ensured, unquote. So he is very libertarian, anarchist in his thinking. He's saying essentially, look, we don't even know what anything is. We don't know if the world's real outside of our own perception. So that's why I shouldn't have to pay taxes, which, okay. But preoccupied with the Babylon working as he had been, he was very obsessive during that time. Parsons had indeed neglected his duties toward the lodge and its members. This was perhaps the final straw for many of his peers, and we get the impression that many of them considered him to be kind of, a drama queen. He's high maintenance, he's a difficult person, and they were tired of his waywardness and saw an opportunity to cut him down to size. The various members of the lodge never seemed to have much compassion in snitching on each other in letters they would write to Crowley, and he received reports from several different sources on this latest escapade of Parsons. From these reports, Crowley concluded that Parsons' flaws had finally overcome his promise, and that Parsons was a gullible fool beyond redemption. He was, furthermore, infuriated by Parsons' intimations that, in the interest of secrecy, he could not provide a full account of what had transpired during the working. Parsons was then suspended from his position as head of the lodge and departed soon after. So the Babylon working permanently alienates Parsons from Crowley, and up until this point, Crowley had been like a father figure to Parsons, because remember, he grows up without a dad, essentially. The mom kicked the dad out very early on, cut him out of Jack's life. I think that they had, when Jack was older, like one or two conversations, but they never really had a relationship. And so, Parsons is kind of vulnerable at that time and looking for that father figure. Crowley was that for a while, and even Hubbard, to a degree, I think, kind of filled part of that void in his life. So but the Babylon working is kind of the final straw between Parsons and Crowley. 2 short letter extracts show Crowley's disappointment with Jack Parsons, both as it happens to Louis T. Culling. In the course of a letter dated October 1946, he said about JWP, that's John Whiteside Parsons or Jack Parsons, all I can say is that I am very sorry. I feel sure that he had fine ideas, but he was led astray, firstly by Smith, referencing Wilfred Smith, the former head of the lodge. Then he was robbed of his last penny by a confidence man named Hubbard. His last words are in a letter from 1946 in which he writes, I have no further interest in Jack and his adventures. He is just a weak-minded fool and must go to the devil his own way. So, there you go. In the course of a letter in January 1950, Parsons draws attention to an interesting similarity between L. Ron Hubbard and Edward Kelly. In the course of the Babylon working, the rituals included the Enochian call of the seventh air. This is in line with the passage in Liber 49 where Parsons was urged to seek me in the seventh air. Parsons continued, I have the text of Dee's scrying in the seventh air, which he said so terrified me that, beseeching God to have mercy upon me, I finally answer that I will from this day forward meddle no more herein. The voice, speaking from Kelly, resulted in a sinister dissociation of Kelly's personality. The parallel with my own working with Ron is appalling. After this, Kelly robbed Dee, absconded with his wife, and developed a criminal confidence career. So Parsons, and by the way, that letter was to Marjorie Cameron, he is kind of figuring out, you know, of course, after what happened with L. Ron Hubbard, but he's seeing these similarities of like, hey, L. Ron and I were out in the desert and we're doing they're using this Enochian magic that is developed by John Dee and Edward Kelly, and then they seem to be having these parallel experiences of Dee and Kelly, where in this situation, Parsons would be the John Dee person, and L. Ron Hubbard was the Edward Kelly. And for people who don't know the story, to briefly sum it up, John Dee and Edward Kelly would do these scrying sessions where they had this black obsidian crystal thing, and Kelly would be the one who would kind of do the scrying. He was the L. Ron Hubbard in the situation, and he tells John Dee at one point that the angels that they believe they're talking to, you know, obviously these are not angels, but in fact demons. But the angels have said that they have to swap wives, you know, because they have to share everything for the ritual. So yeah, that's the parallels that apparently even Parsons picked up on. In 1948, Parsons loses his security clearance to perform classified government defense work. And for a man of his profession, this is essentially like the end of the road of his professional career and his ability to make a livelihood. This action was stated to be because of his membership in a religious cult believed to advocate sexual perversion organized at subjects' home, which has been reported subversive. Parsons commented later that he was suspended on the charges of belonging to the OTO and circulating Liber Oz. Parsons defended himself in closed court and the charges were actually dropped, but in the meantime, his, current girl at that time, Marjorie Cameron, left him, and their estrangement lasted several years. What caused this estrangement, we don't really know, but it seemed final at the time. In the document referred to earlier, Analysis by Master of the Temple, he makes the following allusion again, and this time Parsons is speaking like in the third person, talking kind of to himself and about himself. Very odd. He writes, Candy, remember this is what Marjorie Cameron was calling herself, Candy appeared in the answer to your call in order to wean you from wet nursing. She has demonstrated the nature of woman to you in such unequivocal terms that you should have no further room for illusion on the subject. The suspension and inquisition was my opportunity, one of the final chains in the link. At this time, you were enabled to prepare your thesis, formulate your will, and take the oath of the abyss, thus making it possible, although only partially, to manifest. The exit of Candy prepares for the final stage of your initial preparation. So, he's getting weird at this point, and mind you that during this time, he is described by one member of the lodge to be as coked up as a snowbird. So there you have it. And he's acting, he's having a hard time. but Parsons still considers himself to be a member of the AA. This is Crowley's other organization. And in December 1948, he takes the oath of Magister Templi and adopts the name Beleriand Antichrist. He literally starts referring to himself as an Antichrist. This oath was apparently taken in the presence of Wilford T. Smith. Remember, the guy who was running the Agape Lodge before Crowley maneuvered him out and put Parsons in charge, with whom he'd evidently retained some sort of relationship. In 1949, he issues the Book of the Antichrist. In this short text, Parsons relates how he was stripped of everything he was and then rededicated to Babylon. That was, he considered this to be a recharging of the current generated by the Babylon working, and he pledged that the work of the beast 666 would be fulfilled, and he seems to have seen that work as being in part a way to subvert Christian ethics. He further prophesied that within 7 years Babylon would manifest and bring his work to fruition. There was a reunion in late 1949 or early 1950 between Parsons and Marjorie Cameron, and they started living together again as husband and wife. In the following years, Parsons was reduced to doing small jobs like repairing washing machines and making pyrotechnics for Hollywood movies until he secured a contract as a chemical researcher for Hughes Aerospace. This newfound position of authority would not last long, however, as in 1950 the FBI began investigating Parsons for theft of documents from Hughes, and their investigation revealed Parsons had planned to exchange rocket plans with the newly founded Israeli government in exchange for admission into Israel. Now, whether or not there was this theft of documents, or if somebody, made an allegation, we don't really know. I mean, the FBI was interested in him and watching him for a while, probably going back to his connections to von Karman and the Communist Party, the people he was hanging out with back then. And so I find this interesting for another reason, though, and that is that one of the members of the Suicide Squad turns out to be the grandfather of Ghislaine Maxwell. Another member of the Suicide Squad was a Chinese man who later defects from the United States, goes back to China, and becomes the godfather of the Chinese space program. There's a lot going on here, but it is a fact that Parsons was in discussions to try to get to Israel. And he had written a proposal. Apparently, he basically adopted something he had written for Hughes. He basically took kind of like the same wording and applied it to this proposal for the newly formed Israeli government to help them create like a rocket program and a space program. So it seems that Parsons was working towards building up some sort of teaching order with a Thelemic core, but relating to paganism and witchcraft, and was preparing papers of instruction for such an order. By profession, he is now building his own chemicals practice. He had sold the main part of his property, the mansion itself, for redevelopment sometime earlier, and occupied the coach house. The garage he'd converted into a laboratory equipped with chemicals and equipment. And there was apparently a plan to move to Mexico for a while. This was to pursue both his mystical and magical research and to further his chemical or alchemical practice. He and Marjorie Cameron had vacated the coach house, and Parsons went back and forth over the course of several days, moving out his chemicals into a trailer. On one such visit, on the afternoon of June 17th, 1952, it is alleged that he dropped a container of fulminate of mercury, a highly unstable explosive. They claim that he was mixing it in a coffee can and that he dropped it and it caused an explosion, and that this is what killed him. The resulting explosion was powerful and devastating, destroying most of the coach house. Parsons was seriously injured. Horrifically enough, though, he was apparently still alive and conscious when rescuers got to him. He had an arm vaporized. Part of his legs were gone. Apparently half of his face was blown off, and it's quite a story. He ends up dying an hour later in the hospital, and there is a lot of controversy over his death. Many people believe that it's very unlikely that a scientist of his experience, somebody who'd worked with explosives for a long time, could so mishandle such a powerful explosive. During the last days, he wrote what was probably his last letter to Karl Germer. It is bizarre and merits quoting in full. It perhaps casts light on his frame of mind at the time that this was happening. He writes, "No doubt you will be delighted to hear from an adept who has undertaken the operation of his HGA. This means Holy Guardian Angel, in accord with our traditions. The operation began auspiciously with a chromatic display of psychosomatic symptoms and progressed rapidly to acute psychosis. The operator has altered satisfactorily between manic hysteria and depressing melancholy stupor on approximately 40 cycles, and satisfactory progress has been maintained in social ostracism, economic collapses, and mental dissociation." These statements are mentioned not in any vainglorious spirit of conceit, but rather that they may serve as comfort and inspiration to other aspirants on the path. Now I'm off to the wilds of Mexico for a period, also in pursuit of the elusive Holy Guardian Angel, before winding up in the guard room, finally via the booby hotels, the graveyard, or ... If in the final you can tell all the little practices that I wouldn't have missed it for anything. No one once called 210. So he signs his letter there. No one once called 210. If you recall from part 1, that was his magical number. And so it's a very odd letter. He's referencing, having these symptoms of dissociation and like psychosis, hysteria, depressing melancholy. He talks about losing everything, being socially ostracized, and having this like economic collapse. He basically had a come down. And so that was kind of his frame of mind around the time. And the manner of his death brings to mind the association of Babylon with flame. The lengthy passage quoted earlier in The Vision and the Voice used the idea of flame, as did the material working communicated during the Babylon working. There was a passage from the Babylon working that says, "For she shall absorb thee, and thou shalt become living flame before she incarnates," is particularly haunting. In some of his letters, written in the years after the Babylon working, Parson seemed to be expecting a violent death, and he almost certainly had this passage in mind. A fragment survives from an earlier version of the Book of Babylon, which is interesting in this connection. It says, "Because of this mystery, Babylon is incarnate upon the earth today, awaiting the proper hour for her manifestation. And this my book that is dedicated to her is preparation and a portent for that time. And in that day my work will be accomplished, and I shall be blown away upon the breath of a father, even as it is prophesied." And thus I labor lonely, an outcast and abominable, and he-goat upon the muck heaps of the world. Yet I am content with my lot, since though I am clothed with barn cloth, yet shall I come in power in purple, for of this I am contemptuous, yea, I am. Parsons dies in this explosion in 1952 at just 37 years old. And there's some other questions about his death. People have said that maybe he was assassinated, maybe there was some industrial espionage going on, or maybe there was a magic experiment gone wrong. But an interesting aspect is that Marjorie Cameron, who was his wife at the time, was not allowed to see his body. And I find that interesting. There are people who have speculated that perhaps he faked his death. Now, I think that's highly unlikely, but it is something to consider nonetheless, that maybe this was part of his deal with the Israeli government, that they faked his death and somehow got him out of there and brought him to Israel. I mean, we'll never know, who knows, but it's something to consider, like all the other theories. And the same day that Parsons dies, upon hearing about the death of her son, his mother, Ruth, apparently took her own life with a deliberate overdose of Nembutal. So, that's another odd thing, that his mom would commit suicide the same day he died. It seems a little weird, right? Upon searching the Parsons residence, police investigator Donald Harding and George Santemeyer, the latter a close friend of Parsons, allegedly discovered a box that contained a film that had inappropriate material on it. And so it's a very perplexing story. There's still many unanswered questions, and this is really just, you know, a short, deep dive into the life of Parsons. There's a lot more that you could get into, but that could be 10 hours. So many questions remain about what he was doing. Was he ever recruited by the Soviets in his early days, hanging around with the Communist Party? Was there ever a point that, you know, maybe he became a double agent or something of that nature? I don't know. Is there a connection between Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard and John Dee and Edward Kelly? Did Parsons and Hubbard open some kind of portal or Stargate? Because right after the Babylon working, we get the modern UFO phenomenon and people talking about seeing a lot of these entities that look very similar to Lamb, who we covered in part 1, and might have Parsons' interest in Israel been connected more to his magical workings? Was there something there that he was interested in? Was there, you know, is there some kind of Stargate or portal or some geological area that has significance to his magical workings? And is that why he wanted to move there? Beyond, you know, the work that he would get, obviously, running their space program. It's all very strange and very weird, and very much a cautionary tale of Jack Parsons was the kind of guy who wanted to know everything. He wanted to figure out the secrets for everything. He wanted to know how the universe worked, in this constant thirst for worldly knowledge, and willing to do anything to obtain it, ultimately brought about his untimely, very early death at 37 years old. So I'm interested to know what you guys think of this, and I hope you all have a good day. Whee!